Hey, it's Jeff with DaringDino.com. In this video, you'll learn how to create a great turntable animation in Blender. I'll cover how to set up the camera to automatically move around the object or an empty, and I'll wrap up with some tips on how to save an animation for the web. So let's see what we're about to create. Awesome, let's get right into it now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a subject into our scene so that we can see exactly what we're doing here. So I'm going to do Shift A to add a monkey, and I'm going to set it to smooth, and I'm going to use Control 2 to set it to 2 subdivision levels, and that way it just looks nice. And I'm also going to start seeing how this looks in my world, and you might be wondering how this world looks. So great. And I just want to mention really quick before we get too far along that I have some great freebies that are available if you sign up for the newsletter available at daringdino.com/newsletter. Or you can just go to daringdino.com and it's up in the menu bar. And you can get this free and it's super easy. All right, so the first thing we really need to do is to add in a camera into the scene. So I'm going to do Shift A and add a camera. Now I'm going to clear its rotation with Alt R, just so that it's not pointing in the same direction as my view, because I don't want to do that. And I'm going to rotate it on the X axis by 90 degrees. So RX 90 and enter. I'm going to move it back a little bit in a second, but we'll get to that. So now I'm going to jump into top view mode by hitting 7 on my number pad. And you can see I'm in top view mode, and zoom out just a little bit. And now I'm going to go to Shift A, add a curve and a circle. And this circle is going to be our guide for the camera to orbit around our object. So I want it to be a little bit bigger. And basically picture this circle being the back track, or the track underneath a train, and the train's going to go around this circle, so to speak, and the camera is going to be going around it and pointing into the middle. So far so good. The circle is right along the same lines as our object, which should be fine, and we'll keep it there for now. So now I'm going to select my camera, and we're going to make it move around this path. So to do that, I'm going to go to my properties panel and go to constraints, add an object constraint, and I'm going to follow path. So it's right over here. Okay. So anytime you are adding something, either a modifier or a constraint, and you see it red up here, that means that it's not doing anything right now. And that's because we don't have anything really configured. Some of these things have items selected, like it has forward as being the y-axis and up as z, but we don't have some of the stuff up here configured. So the first thing I need to do is click in here, and you see it only gives me one option, even though I have a couple different objects in the scene. And that's because this can only follow a path. So the only object we have right now is this Bezier circle. So I'm going to select that, and immediately you see it jump over here. If I do Alt A to start the animation, nothing happens though. So what I want to do is animate the path. And by clicking this button, what it'll do is it will automatically add an animation for us. By default, it's set to move 100% in 100 frames, which might be fine for you, but I'll show you in a minute just exactly how to configure that. So I'm going to click Animate Path. And now if I jump back to the beginning by clicking this back arrow here and hit Alt A, our camera is moving, but it's not pointing towards the center. It's just kind of flying around. And if I go and hit 0 on my numpad, you can see that my camera is moving around, but it's not orbiting around how I want. So I'm going to stop the animation with Alt A and jump back to the beginning just to make it a little bit easier. So what I also want to do is say follow curve. And you see as soon as I check that, now when I hit Alt A, it's moving around the path and it's pointing kind of the right direction, but not quite the right direction. So it's getting closer. So I'm going to jump back to the beginning again. So I'm going to rotate my camera around the z-axis 90 degrees by doing RZ90. And you can see that it doesn't look quite right. I don't think that worked. Let me try one more time. Jumping back to the beginning, RZ90. And there you go. You can see it's pointing away from my object. So if I hit Alt-A to animate, it's getting closer. So now all we need to do is tell it which way to face. So I just want to say forward is -y instead of +y. And now if I animate it, now it's doing exactly what we want. And if I jump into the camera mode, that's our animation. Now you see a jump there, and that's because we're cutting off at frame 250. So it's 250% done with the animation, and then it skips back to the beginning. So we'll fix that in just a second. But essentially, that's exactly what we want to do. The up axis is Z. Obviously, you can't have it be anything with Y, because if I do that, it will give me an error, because you can't have the forward axis be the same as the up axis. So let's just change that back to Z. And let's jump back to the beginning. So you might want to save your file now. So I will go ahead and do that really quick, and I'll just save this. I don't know. Let's just save this in my Blender folder, tutorials, and let's make a new folder and call it rotate or something like that. And we'll go into this folder and save this. Always a good idea to save your files when you get to something that works. So we're not done yet though. We're gonna tweak this just a little bit to make it look perfect. So if I look at my camera view, this actually doesn't look terrible, but what if I wanted it to be zoomed in a little bit more on my object here? Or what if it was way too close? I'll show you a couple different ways you can fix that. So the first thing you'll probably want to do is set up your camera and set your focal length to be exactly what you want. If this was a person, like a character model, or something you're doing with someone's face, 35 millimeters isn't necessarily the best focal length to use. I would suggest something like 80 millimeters, but you'll see if I do that, now we're way too close. So how do we fix that? Well, since this is all driven by this circle, this Bezier curve, I can just scale it up. And then if I look at my camera again, now I can see my whole object. And if I animate this with Alt-A, it's looking good. You might also notice that it's kind of jumpy a little bit. And that's because our curve is a curve object which has a certain resolution to it. So you'll see here it's 12. And just for the point of making an example, I'm going to change it to 3. And now you can see how it's got like very few points. It's got basically 3 points for every 90 degrees. So I'm going to bump that way up to 30 to make it super smooth. And that way it's not going to have any jittering back and forth. Let's see what else. I also want to change the animation speed. What if I think this is way too fast? Which, to be honest, it is pretty fast. If you're doing a turntable, maybe you want it to be a little bit slower. So let's pretend like we want this to be a 200 frame long. So let's change this to 200. And we want it to go once around in those 200 frames. So right now it's going around twice. So it's halfway. It's gone around once at 100 frames, and then it'll be around twice at 200 frames. So at least it's looping now, but let's jump into how to set that up. So the easiest way to do this is to go into your animation layout. And what you really want is this graph editor over here. You don't really need this dope sheet. So what I'm going to do is right click here and join and make this area a lot bigger and expand this out. And then I'm just scrolling with my scroll wheel out, and I'm going to make it so that we can actually see what's going on here. So if I adjust this a little bit more, just like that, hit N to bring up my panel on the side, we can see what's making this thing actually move. So if I scrub through my timeline here, you can see as I move back and forth, that's what's making this thing go. And if I go to 100, you can see it's back at the beginning now. And if I go back to 0, again, it's at the beginning, or frame 1. So this is all driven by a y equals basically m plus x. So this is a offset. So I'm going to set this to 0 so that on frame 0, it's at 0. And then I'm going to set this to be 0.5. So this is basically like the slope of the line. And when it's at 1, it's going to say 100% is at 100 frames. And if I change it to 0.5, it's going to be 100% at 200 frames. So if I zoom out here and I'm looking at my lines down here, I've got 50, 100, 150, 200, and then I go up from 200 and I see it at 200, it's exactly at 100 right here. So now if I hit Alt-A to play my animation, the camera's moving at half the speed. So it's only going to go once around every 200 frames, which is exactly what I want to do. Now, if you want something to be shorter, let's say you only want 60 frames, all you'd have to do is make it so that wherever it's cutting off your end of your animation, that the value is 100. So you can do a little bit of math to do that, or you can just play around with it and make do with what you've got. But that's how you change the animation speed. It's pretty simple. I just wanted to kind of let you know how that was kind of working. So now that we're done with that, we're going to jump out of this and go back to default because we don't need to worry about that anymore. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you're looking at the path data in the properties panel, you can also see this evaluation time. When I hit animate, it's changing this value because it's keyframed there. So that's how that works. But it sets all that up for you. You don't have to worry about that. Now, we're looking at this object and, we're spinning around it, which is great. But what if this camera angle isn't working for us? Well, I can't really move the camera because it's tied to this curve. So I can move the curve, but if I move the curve, the camera is just pointing towards the center of the curve. So if I'm moving the curve up and down with G and Z, it's kind of doing it, but I can't really rotate the camera exactly how I want. So what I recommend you do is let's actually undo that and let's make some way to control where our camera is pointing to. So we already added a constraint to make it follow the path. Let's add a tracking point. So how I do that is add another object constraint and I go track to under tracking. And then it's going to let me set a target. So for right now, let's just set Suzanne as our target, which I can do that by clicking this eyedropper and clicking on Suzanne. And you'll see it gets messed up again, but we'll fix that really quickly. So what I want to do is say target to -Z, and already it's looking right, but you'll see it's messed up, right? So we need to make up Y. And now it's pointing right at Suzanne. And if I move Suzanne around, our camera is automatically pointing exactly at Suzanne. And the cooler thing is if I grab my circle, my Bezier circle, and I go into the camera and I move my circle up and down, now we're moving perfectly around Suzanne. So I can get a little higher up of an angle, and I might need to scale my circle up a little bit or change my focal length a little bit. Maybe I'll go down to 70 millimeters. And now when I animate it, I'm flying around, but I'm up a little bit. So that's great. But what if your model is kind of complex? Or what if you want to animate where it's focusing on? Well, another thing you could do is let's add an empty. So Shift A and go down to empty. And I always use sphere because I can see it from any angle. It's never invisible. Even if I'm in front view or top view, I can always see it. So let's actually make this what the camera is tracking to. So all I have to do is go back into constraints, and instead of Suzanne, I actually want my empty. And maybe it would be a good idea to name this empty something like camera tracker or something. So something like that. And then obviously when you rename it, it automatically updates it here. And now what I can do is move this independent of my object. So let's say I want it to be more towards the top of Suzanne's head. Well, now it's going to be exactly there. And as I move this empty around with G and Z, it's following exactly where that thing is, which is super awesome. So that's how you kind of configure your camera to be exactly how you want. Now, if I go to my camera view and let's jump around until we're kind of in the front and I hit Shift Z, you can see I've got a white object in a white background, which is great. It helps me focus on this. But what if I want it to look a little bit better? Well, I always recommend for a turntable to add a floor or at least some sort of a pedestal underneath. So what we're going to do is add that right underneath the monkey. So we're going to go into front view. We're going to add a mesh, and let's just add a plane, and we'll have to scoot it down. So let's zoom in a little bit with our scroll wheel, GZ, move it right down there, and then let's scale this up by like 8. And now if I look at my camera view, now I've got a floor. It doesn't look super hot. So let's actually delete that. But before we do, let's move our cursor to selected. And what that'll do is it'll put our cursor right on the floor, right where we added it. So now if I delete it and add something else, it'll add that object right where our cursor already is. So we don't have to move it back down to the Z axis below the monkey again. And let's go into edit mode, hit F to make a face, and scale it back up. And now we've got a nice circle underneath our object. So now as we're looking at it, it looks pretty good. And if I wanted this to look more like a pedestal, I could scale it down, and then I could go back into edit mode with tab, and E, Z is already selected. So I could make it like this, and let's move this back down and something like that. And now, I've got a little pedestal going on here. So that is how you would set that up. So let's render this out and see what we've got. So I'm just going to quickly go over my settings really quick. So I clicked on 1920 by 1080, 100%, start frame 1, end frame 200. That's pretty normal. And frame step 1, that means it goes forward 1 frame at a time. So I'm going to collapse that with A. And then I did 20 samples because I didn't need anything crazy. But most importantly, I clicked this little clock here. And what that does is it makes the noise pattern different for each frame, which makes it so that you don't see any weird artifacts when you do an animation. Very important for animation. You don't need to do it if you're just doing a still image. I also, let's see, made sure I was saving it as a PNG into a folder. And I do it that way because if for some reason I need to stop the animation, I still have all the frames saved into a folder. So just make sure you have that set up. And that's pretty much all you need to do for rendering the animation. It's always a good idea to save your file just before you hit render. And also, I should note to this object, I added a dielectric shader, which I got from Blender Guru, which I will link to that in the description below. Okay, so now you've got your animation. Let's bring it into a video editor to get something that we can share with people. So I'm going to jump into Premiere. I'm going to import my image sequence. So I'm going to go to Blender and tutorials, rotate, go in here. And what I'm going to do is sort by the image name, grab the first one, and this is an image sequence, and I'm going to hit import. And it will make something for me. So if I drag this into the timeline, there we go. I've got my animation showing up perfectly, and it loops, which is great. So now what I want to do is export this. So I'm going to go up to File and Export Media. And once my export settings show up, I'm going to make sure we're in H.264, and that's totally fine. I'm going to make sure we put this in somewhere. I'm actually just going to throw this on the desktop because that's totally fine. Don't have any audio, so I can uncheck that. And if I wanted to scale this down, this would be a perfect place to do it. I'm actually going to do that. So let's make it, I don't know, like 600 pixels wide instead of 1920 by 1080. So it's going to be perfect. And then since we're just taking an image sequence and rendering it, we don't technically need to throw it into the media encoder. So I'm just going to hit export because it'll take a few seconds. It's always a good idea to queue something if you've got something crazier going on, but for this project, we didn't actually need to do that. And since I'm just doing something really basic, I am not going to save this. So I'm going to quit Premiere and say no. And now what I'll do is I'll bring up my render here, and I've got this going and it looks great. So even with just a few samples, you can make something that looks really good if you scale it down like I just did. So what I typically do is I use a site called GiphyCat. So let me launch Safari and let me resize my window here to get this into view. So let's pull that up. And I'm already logged in. You don't need to have an account to do any of this, but it's probably a good idea. And then what I can do is just grab this file and upload it. So let's actually go to upload and drag it in here. And it's got it, and I can give it a title, and I can say create, and this will make a nice animated GIF for me. And then I can share it out, and I don't need to worry about hosting an image anywhere. Can put it on whatever website you want to share it out on, and you're good to go. So that's how you save an animation for the web. Well, I hope you learned a lot in today's video. I think we made a really great turntable animation in Blender. When you create a render with this method, feel free to let me know on Twitter at daring_dino or in the comments below. And don't forget, if you want to get free resources and great tutorials like this, sign up for the Daring Dino newsletter at daringdino.com/newsletter and subscribe to this channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.